offline one-on-one, right? And once the session ends, then you can probably ask your questions. So here's the agenda. We'll start with the architecture, node types, high availability, cluster requirements, deployment examples, sizing guide, and design principle. So if you guys can notice that the topic of my today's discussion is design principle, but this is something which I have kept in the last, right? And there's a reason for that. Because it's very difficult to directly jump into design discussions if we do not have understanding on what is the architecture, how it looks like, how things work. So that is the reason I have kept this thing in a very last, because once you understand everything, then it is very easy to deploy things. So first thing first, this is how vRealize Operation Manager looks like, right? So this is an internal architecture of a vRealize Operations Manager. The moment you deploy any node vRealize Operations Manager, the first node by default becomes a master node, right? And master node has all these 5 layers. It starts from admin and product UI. So admin and product UI, most of the times you'll be interacting with your product UI. Whenever you have to create dashboards, you have to create supermetrics, your views, your graphs, everything, that's all product UI. There are only 3 specific use cases when you log into your admin UI. The first thing, at the first time you're deploying your operations manager, right? Second thing, because of any reason, if your product UI is not available, your Cassandra is not working, your services are not coming up, your cluster has gone into toss. Third, and the most beautiful, when we log a case with GSS, right? And they ask you to log into admin UI. Other than that, you don't really require admin UI. Everything can be done and managed from the product UI. Then it is a collector layer. Collector is a layer where basically you add all your collector instances. It could be a vCenter adapter collector, right? It could be your vSAN, vRealize automation, storage, networking, everything and anything which is available with vROps. So these collectors basically use REST APIs to pull the data from the endpoints, right? Now when the data is pulled, it's in an unstructured format. And vRealize Operation Manager has a very finicky method to understand or analyze the data which is given in a structured way. So that's where the third and the controller layer comes into the picture. It actually massages the data, it puts everything into a structured layer and then passes it on to the analytics layer, and that is where the brain lies. All your dynamic thresholds, your graphs, your dashboards, everything runs from analytics. This is where the intelligent runs from vRealize Operations Manager. And the last layer is persistence layer. As the name suggests, is a place where actually the data is residing. So there are 3 types of databases which are available in Operations Manager. As a Postgres database, you have file system database and historical database. I'm not getting into what exactly these databases is, so probably we'll cover it some other time. And there are basically 4 modes of deploying a vRealize Operations Manager. As I spoke, like the first node which you deploy, it by default becomes a master node, right? The next node after a master node you deploy, it is a data node. The difference between a data node and a master node is data node does not have the analytics to run. It is only collecting the data, it is pushing it, it acts as an analytics layer to support master, but it does not contain the entire hierarchy. It doesn't have the database to store the historical information. Any data node can be promoted as a master replica node. It's just a click of button away. You click on enable HA. The moment you do that, any of the data node is promoted as a master replica node. Now why we need a master replica node? To create a high availability. I have a slide to talk about why do we need a high availability. And the last is remote collector. Now this particular node type is required only if you have a environment where you want to collect the data, but you don't want to put the entire vRealize operations cluster there, right? So in a remote collector, there are only 2 layers, right? So it has only admin UI. Hey, is it working? Yeah. It has admin UI and a collector UI, right? So it basically is required only to collect the data and passes it on to your master node. When vRealize Operations Manager is running in a cluster, it is called an analytics cluster. So if I'm referring an analytic cluster, that means one master node, maybe one master replica and bunch of data nodes running together for a single operations. Clear so far? Now, should or should not enable high availability? So see, we run in an environment where high availability plays a very important role. Whether it is a vSphere or our infrastructure layer, we always want a redundancy from failures. In vRealize Operations Manager, there's something called high availability, which can be enabled, as I said, right, just with a click of button. The moment you click that button, what happens? Any of the available data node becomes a master replica node, right? What master replica node is that at any given point in time, if there is master unavailability or any of the data node, if it goes bad or if it crashes, your cluster is not impacted. But there's a caveat to that. The very first is it can only withstand one node failure. Even if you have a bigger analytics cluster, if there is more than one node failure, it doesn't work. Your cluster goes into a toss. This is one thing. Another thing is, for example, you have sized an environment to monitor 40,000 objects. The moment you enable high availability, your capacity goes to half. You can only monitor 20,000 objects with the same amount of resources. Why? Because now the same data is stored twice the way. So you are actually using twice the space to store the same amount of data. It also causes on your CPU and memory resources. So that is where you have to make a decision, right? So this is the open area of discussion. Do you want to enable high availability, or do you want to go ahead with the plain infrastructure monitoring without high availability? But the moment you enable it, you get some added advantages. For all those geeks, right? These are all the Gemfire ports and all. I don't really understand all of this, right? If you're running your vROps cluster within the same vSphere cluster, within the same L2 segment, the only port you have to remember is port 443. It should be bidirectionally open to all the endpoints. So if you see on the outer of the circle, right, you only have to worry about port 443, HTTP, HTTPS, right? This is where your endpoint agents will connect with your vROps, your vCenter adapter, or pretty much anything which you connect with your vRealize Operations Manager. This is where it will interact with. Now a lot of text. Okay, so I'll start with, now we have understood what is a vRealize Operations Manager, right? We understood what are the node types. We understood what all ports are required to create this. But now I'm going to start. I have to see the entire discussion of this presentation is to make yourself comfortable that, okay, I can go ahead and deploy my own vRealize Operations Manager. Nothing to kill our own professional services, but yes, right? We want everybody to understand how things work, right? And this is where we start from. Now, once we have our understanding ready, then it is time to deploy the clusters. Few caveats, few things which we need to remember is, as I said, right, deploy all your vRealize Operations Manager node into the same vSphere cluster. Guys, vRealize Operations Manager is a highly IO intensive application. It's going to use huge amount of metrics, objects and data to interact with each other, not only to the endpoints, to within itself also. Right? Master node is talking to a bunch of remote collectors and data nodes, and it is collecting huge amount of metrics and information and processing it, right? So that's where it is important to have it in the same vSphere cluster so that the IO operation is not bursting, right? Because in an idle situation, you would only want your application IOs to travel, right? And your infrastructure IO should be 0. That's an ideal condition which we try to achieve, which is impossible, but we want to minimize it, so that's why keep it concise within your vSphere cluster. Apply DRS anti-affinity rule. Why it is required? Because even if I enable a high availability, in any case, DRS anti-affinity rule, right? Like not two VMs should at any given point in time should reside on the same ESXi host. Because even if I enable high availability, if there are two vROps nodes or vROps appliances which are residing on the same host, if that goes down, my cluster goes down, right? So if I have an anti-affinity rule, so that means not two VMs are residing on the same host at any given point in time. Consider 100% reservation of your CPU and memory to Operations Manager, because if you're placing these virtual machines on a cluster or on a ESXi host, which has huge amount of contention or cost of value or ready time, which is on a higher side, it is going to impact your performance, right? So make sure the cluster which are where the vROps virtual machines are residing, they're free from that. They have enough of resources to support this. Latency should be within 5 milliseconds. Like I have a master node in one cluster and I have a data node in another vSphere cluster. Even though they're part of the same vCenter, but if the latency is crossing beyond 5 milliseconds, it's going to create some performance impacts. And vROps, when it starts giving you performance, it's a nightmare, right? So make sure the latency part is always covered. So there are two latencies which you need to be worried about. First is analytics latency. one master node talking to other master replica or data node, that is less than 5 milliseconds. If you have a remote collector in your environment, which we'll talk about in the deployment examples, then latency should not cross 200 milliseconds. If it crosses, again, there's a problem. Consider DNS forward and lookup, reverse lookup zones, right? Because vROps relies a lot into DNS. So make sure all are configured properly. Make sure you have all the static IPs. If not possible, at least your master and master replica must have static IPs, right? And the last, remote collector traffic can be routed, but netting is not supported. So routing means I have a head office in Pune, I have a branch office maybe in Satara or Kolhapur, right? And there's not a big environment. So I don't want to put the entire vROps cluster there. I have deployed a bunch of remote collectors there and I'm pushing the data. In that case, make sure the network is only in a routed way. It is not NATed, right? So because it doesn't understand that. Okay, so now we have covered what all we need to be worried about when I'm creating a vROps cluster. So now we'll talk about the deployment examples. So whatever I'm talking about today, this is not something which I have learned, enlightened by myself. This is all available with the vRealize Operations Manager administration guide and designing guides, and also VMware validated design. I have tried to pick information from them, those documents, and try to create an IKEA kind of approach. Now you have your environment, you understand your environment. There are a bunch of deployment examples, right? These are the certified or the valid ways to deploy your operations manager. You can try to match if that deployment example matches to what you have in your environment. The first and very simple one, single node deployment, right? But the question is, why do we need that, right? It doesn't have high availability, it doesn't have anything. Why do we need a single node deployment? So I personally feel the very first thing, which this kind of deployment gives you a hands-on experience, right? You don't want to get into right now, in the very first stage, you want to create your custom dashboards or, create all the super metric. It's going to be a tedious job for you. So this deployment example gives you a free hand, at least to try and test things out. But even important to that, there's one more use case. Whenever you're doing any sizing for your operations manager, you need to answer a lot of questions, right? How many objects are you monitoring? What are the number of adapters in your environment? What is the total number of metrics which are collected in your environment? So all this information, if you do not know pre-hand, this is a very good approach. You deploy one single node, right? You let it run for a couple of weeks, attach all the adapters which you will probably monitor in your environment, and there's something called system audit report. Download that report in a PDF format. You have all the answers well in advance with you, so that when you're doing an actual deployment for your production, it doesn't impact you. You have all the information, and your sizing is more accurate because it's all about sizing. So if you incorrectly size your vRealize Operations Manager, probably within a couple of months you'll end up facing some issues. So it's very important to take sizing very seriously. And this is not something which I'm talking from bookish things. I interact with the customer on a daily basis, and this is something which people sitting here in this room know whom I'm referring to, right? Another deployment example. This is a high availability node deployment, right? You have two or more than two vROps nodes running, right? You enable high availability, and then you directly attach your vCenter adapters to either of the data node, right? And in this case, you have a high availability in your analytics cluster, so that at any given point in time, if one of the node goes down, you still have room to play. This is a deployment where you have a larger environment. You have multiple vCenter servers, or maybe another endpoints like your vSAN or VRA endpoints, and probably you want to monitor larger infrastructure. In that case, you can go ahead with this kind of deployment where you size your environment, right? How are we sizing this? We're going to cover it, right? So let's assume I have sized my environment, and it says that I need, if I enable a high availability, I need one master replica, and probably 6 data nodes, right? And then you size your environment, you deploy it, then configure individual vCenter or endpoints to the data node. Now, if you see the difference in this slide is I have connected everything. If I count this as a master, this is a master replica, I'm connecting all my endpoints to a data node, and there's a reason to do that. Because master node is basically required to do all the analytics related judgments, right? It is a decision maker authority. So it is advisable for a larger environment to keep your master node free from all those collection mechanisms. So if I connect it to data node, it will collect the data, it will pass it on to master node, and that's when the analytics will start. This is another environment where remote collectors are also coming into the picture. Remember, this remote collector, it has everything related to your vROps, but only it is working on two layers, admin and collector. So I have an environment, right? And I have a production environment sitting in Pune, and I have a remote office or a branch office, maybe sitting in Kolhapur or Satara or some remote location. I do not have much infrastructure, so I don't want to go ahead and deploy the entire vROps cluster there, but I have a small workload running there. So what I can do is I can deploy bunch of remote collectors, right? And collaboratively, when more than 2 remote collectors are deployed in the same environment, they form a collector group, right? So collector group gives you added advantage. Rather than configuring your individual vCenter adapters to your remote collector, you're connecting it to the collector group. So at any given point in time, if any of this remote collector goes down, I can bring in another remote collector and put it there. And the beauty of that is you're deploying everything from the same OVA file, right? It is all, when you actually go ahead and decide the role, that's when you select whether you want to make this appliance as a master node or data node or a remote collector. So you don't have to remember a lot of things, right? One of my remote collector goes down, I replace it with another one. It's hardly half an hour job, right? This is another example where one of my vCenter or a couple of my endpoints, they are sitting in a different network zone, right? This is in a separate LAN. However, it is part of the entire data center, right? But they're into a different network zone, and there is a latency issue. The latency is more than 10 milliseconds, right? Or 20 milliseconds. So that's where I can go ahead and deploy a remote collector, configure those endpoints to that remote collector. Now I have a room till 200 milliseconds to play. And I can do this kind of deployment. Now there's something called endpoint agents, right? So endpoint agents, now vRealize Operations Manager can monitor your infrastructure from a hypervisor perspective or from a virtual machine perspective, but still it does not have visibility to look inside guest operating system. What if I want to monitor a particular service, SQL service, for example? I have a database running. I want to be notified at any given point in time. If my SQL service goes down, I should get notified, right? How should I do that? Or if I have a Unix or a Linux machine running and I want to monitor a particular PID, that any given point in time, if this process ID goes down, I should be notified, right? So that's where endpoint agent comes into the picture. So these endpoint agent comes in two form. For Windows, it is in the form of exe, and for Linux, it is in the form of RPM. So you deploy or install these endpoint agent. It's just like your VMware tool we are all aware of, right? So just like another VMware tool, I install it inside the guest operating system. It puts a very little overhead on the guest operating system, and port 443 should be bidirectionally open. The moment you do that configuration, your vRealize Operations Manager now starts sensing your application or services also, or process IDs also, right? And now you have a visibility to go inside guest operating system and monitor things, how it works. But there are some points to remember whenever you're doing the endpoint agents. First, place it behind a load balancer, right? Because the moment you install an endpoint agent in any virtual machine, any which ways, vRealize Operations Manager is collecting bunch of metrics. If you deploy endpoint agents, the number of metrics are going to increase. So if you don't need that, you should not do that, right? It's as simple as that. So if it is generating more number of metrics, it is going to put additional burden on your analytics cluster. So make sure if it is an utmost requirement, then only you go ahead with this kind of deployment. Second, place it behind a load balancer followed by your collector group, so that it is not directly sending all burst of data to your analytics node, so that at any given point in time, if you stop this connection, your analytics cluster is running fine. This is again a similar kind of deployment, but now I have a remote office. Maybe it's in Mumbai, Pune, right? And I have a very good WAN connectivity. I'm following up within 200 millisecond thing. That's when I can do this. I can connect my remote network or a WAN network to my analytics nodes, and there is a collector group, and I configure endpoints there. Now, why it is required? it may depend upon the use case, right? Sometimes I talk to customer and they say, I want a single monitoring solution sitting in my data center. I don't want other people to, have access to that. So that's when you can do that, right? But it's not the end of the story. You can mix and match things the way you want, as long as you're falling within the guidelines. Now there's a thing. I have two dedicated sites. I have a site in Pune. I have a data center in Mumbai, and both the data centers are equally, important. And it is very difficult for me to do this remote collector configuration there, because remote collector are not the actual instances which are doing the analytics. It is just collecting the data. And also I want a high availability from a site perspective, that any given point in time, if my site goes down, it should not impact the overall configuration. So how do I do that? I size my individual site, deploy a vRealize Operations Manager analytics cluster in individual sites, then I deploy another instance, right? I deploy another instance of vRealize Operations Manager, and then I install a federation management pack on top of it. Now, federation management pack, if you go to marketplace.vmware.com, you'll find this. Federation management pack is nothing. It is a management pack built by VMware for these kind of deployment, right? I have multi-site environment, but I want a single console to monitor it, so that whenever I log into this vRealize Operations Manager console, I should see holistic information. How many vCenter instances are there in my environment? Number of data stores, what is the growth, right? All those things I can achieve, right? And it has its own dashboards. These dashboards are on and above of what you get in your vRealize Operations Manager. So Federation Management Pack has its own management pack. It has its own graphs and dashboards, which are which are relevant to the information which somebody will require from a holistic point of view. Imagine there's an IT manager. He doesn't care about whether you have 200 VMs or 500 VMs. All I need to know is, I have spent X amount of money in my infrastructure. Am I getting the right throughput out of it? So this is what he's worried about. Or what is my growth from past 6 months? I started with 20 node cluster. Now I have 16 nodes running. What is my growth? Am I taking the right steps toward my infrastructure management? So these all information can be fetched from here. In case if any of your site goes down, right, it doesn't impact, because your sites are individually sized. They have their individual IP address or FQDN where you monitor your infrastructure. The moment, in this case, if this site goes down, if you log into your Federation Management Pack, it will only give you the information related to your site B. Now site A is not available, but that does not mean your site A data goes away, right? The moment you bring up your site A, everything comes back online. But what if the Federation Pack goes down? Even if it goes down, it doesn't matter at all, because this Federation Management Pack does not store any data. What it is doing is it is only doing the aggregation of the data received from these two operations manager. So if this goes down, chuck this off, bring up a new vRealize Operations Management appliance, install that management pack, give it an IP address, you're good to go. So it is not impacting your infrastructure. Good so far? Any questions? Good. Either everything is making sense or nothing is making sense. Okay, sizing guidelines and design principles, right? So now we are coming to the actual thing, the discussion which we started with, right? So the idea was to bring up the momentum gradually, right? And that's when I thought maybe I'll put this design principle in the last. From sizing guideline perspective, as I said, right, so it comes in, vRealize Operation Manager comes in 4 t-shirt sizing: small, medium, large, and extra large. Small starts from 4 vCPUs, 16 to 32 GB RAM, goes all the way to extra large with 24 vCPUs and 120 GB of RAM. So you can have maximum 16 nodes in your medium or in your large deployment. When I say 16 nodes, 1 master node, 1 master replica node, 14 data node, maximum 50 remote collectors, not more than that. You cannot deploy 50 first remote collector. So this is the sizing where you have to play, right? Why we need to remember all those things? Because when I'm sizing my environment, I should know, right? If somebody says you want to deploy extra large sizing, right? I cannot go beyond 6 nodes, right? So this is where these decision or these stats comes into the handy. Same goes to my remote collector. It comes only in 2 sizing, standard and large, right? 2 vCPU, 4 to 8 GB RAM for standard, 4 vCPU, 16 to 32 GB RAM for large deployment size, and the number of objects it works upon. Everything is available in KB, nothing which I have discovered. Go ahead and you can download it. So even if you don't take the screenshot, that's okay. Now we are coming to the real sizing thing, right? I have understood now how vROps works, what is the architecture, how many nodes, right? What are the deployment methodologies, but how do I start, right? So earlier with every vRealize operations manager, there was a KB article which VMware used to release. It has an Excel sheet called a basic sizing guideline. You put on all the information to that and it will give you the result. But now, around a month back probably, right? So we have come up with this online sizer. The URL is over there, vropsizer.vmware.com. The moment you log into that URL, first thing is it's going to ask you is what is your vROps version, right? So by the way, right now we are on 7.0, which is the latest operations manager version, right? Prior to that was 6.7, then 6.6.1, 6.6, 6.5, 6.4, and so on. So it starts from 6.5 till 7.0, right? You can select what is the version which you're deploying. However, VMware always recommends to download and deploy the latest softwares because the latest software comes with their own benefits. The moment you select that, next thing is it's going to ask you, do you want to go ahead with the basic deployment or advanced sizing? So basic sizing means this screenshot comes from basic sizing, right? So the moment you select a basic sizing, there are reasons why you should select a basic sizing and not an advanced, and vice versa. Basic sizing is only selected if you are monitoring only your vCenter adapters. You have one or two maybe vCenter server which you want to monitor, nothing more than that. That's when the only place when you will select basic sizing. Everything apart from that, if you have any other use case, start with the advanced sizing. In basic sizing, it will ask you number of vCenter server, data stores, connected, host. That's all. And it will give you the result. So if you see it gives me a result, extra large, large, medium. How many nodes do I require? If I go ahead with the sizing which I have put in this sheet, I can go ahead with one large node with 16 vCPU, 48 GB of RAM, 193 GB of disk, and these many IOPS it is going to generate. This is estimated, but more or less this is where you will land into. Now this sizing is without enabling high availability. The moment you enable high availability, the specs will change. So make your decision before, right? Operations manager is very finicky when it comes to making ad hoc changes, right? So you decided with some environment today and later you decide, no, it's not okay, let's add 3 more vCenter server. That's not how things will work. There is a limit where you horizontally and vertically can scale. We'll talk about it. Now comes the advanced sizing sheet. So for example, if you have your VRA in your environment, you have vSAN, you have EMC storage, you have other endpoints apart from your vCenter server, that's when you select this option. The moment you select, there are a bunch of options, right? You have to select number of port groups in your distributed switch, number of vSAN instances running, your vRealize automation, adapter information, all that information. You put in that information and then you will come to know the sizing based upon that advanced results. It's important to keep some buffer while you're filling this information, right? So we'll talk about it in the design principle, right? So probably this is the second last slide. So please bear with me for more 5 minutes. First line, monitor everything. That's not an answer. Usually I go to customer and we do this workshop and we ask, sir, let's sit down, let's discuss what all you want to monitor. I want to monitor everything, right? This is not the first step. Probably you should start from a smaller deployment, right? I'll start with vSphere first. I'll monitor it for a couple of weeks or a couple of months and then I'll see how things work. And then probably I'll add another endpoints. Because if you're directly landing into so when you start swimming, you don't jump into a sea, right? You start from swimming pool and then canals and then eventually, right? So don't make that mistake. Don't start monitoring everything. It is not going to give you any benefit, right? And you'll end up getting frustrated that this product is not working fine. The problem is not with the product. The problem is how we approach it. Start with small and then gradually keep on adding, because then you will understand it better. And also operations manager is not a product where you deploy today and you start seeing the results tomorrow. It takes at least 2 to 4 weeks time to learn your infrastructure, all your dynamic thresholds, all your information related to your infrastructure. It is going to take fruitful impact only after 2 to 4 weeks of use. Another, don't install management pack just because they are available. If you go to marketplace.vmware.com, you'll find hundreds of these management packs. Some are developed by VMware, which are of course free of cost. Some are developed by Blue Medora or other storage or network vendors, which are attached to license. But still, there are a whole bunch of management packs available free of cost. But don't just go ahead and deploy everything. Follow the first rule. Don't monitor everything. Start from scratch. Take a gradual approach, because see, everything and anything which you're attaching to your operations manager, it is going to put some load on your analytics cluster. It is going to create some metrics. It is going to store somewhere. It is going to use your compute to for the processing. So if you attach everything to your operations manager cluster, probably it will end up doing that analytics and it will not give you fruitful results. I spoke to you about that the contention in the cluster. So make sure wherever you're deploying your operations manager virtual machines or OVAs, it is not falling into any contention values, right? Co-stop and CPU ready are two very handy ESX top metrics. Just keep a watch on that. If it is going beyond a threshold, maybe it is a time you should move your vROps nodes to another cluster where there is sufficient resource to support it. Define RBACs, user-based role access, right? So not everybody wants to access everything. The default user is admin, but once we deploy operations manager, everybody is accessing admins. And then you get to see, okay, let me click here and see what happens. And maybe your click can, make some changes which are not required for the environment. From vRealize Operation 7.0, there's a very good feature. Even if you create a dashboard for your SQL Server user, without even creating that user in your vRealize Operations Manager, you can still give access to that, and that to a time-bound access. You'll create a dashboard. It'll ask you, do you want to export it in the form of a URL? You say yes. It will ask you what is the expiry date of that URL. You'll say probably 24 hours. For 24 hours, no matter whosoever in the environment, the moment they access that URL, they'll be able to see that dashboard. But after 24 hours, it goes away. And this has come basically a request from users, because earlier it was a tedious job to create users within vROps and then give access. And then probably after 2 months or 3 months, when that application requirement is over, it's very difficult to revoke things back, right? Keep the deployment simple, right? Just because you can complicate the design does not mean you should complicate it. I was into a training last month in Singapore. It was advanced architecture training, and we were given some tasks to design environment and create some designs, and people came with very good ideas, right? So, and few of the designs were really appealing, but at the same time complex, right? And that's when they gave us a feedback that always a complicated design is not a good design. The design should be simple, understandable, so that if I passes that on to another one, he's able to understand it and expand it. So make sure your deployment is very simple. If you're going with 4 nodes, stick to 4 nodes. If you don't need remote collector, please don't deploy it. If you don't need endpoint agents, don't do that. If you don't need management packs, don't install it. Keep it very simple. Do not design for today. Keep room for tomorrow. This is what I talk about, right? When we are doing this advanced sizing sheet, so there is a way, if you can put the information which you probably know that in next 3 months or 6 months, because the environment is any which way is going to grow. You will have more number of hosts, you will have more number of virtual machines, more endpoints to monitor. So it is good that right from the beginning, you take that approach. You put that information well in advance, so that instead of 2 or 3 large nodes, you're deploying 4 or 5 large nodes, so that tomorrow, if there's a situation which comes in, you're already covered for that. Another thing, always go for a smaller node count. For example, if you do all the sizing, right, we saw that it is giving you information small, large, medium, XL. If it is asking you 4 large node versus 12 medium node, go with the lower count, 4 large nodes. Why? Remember, we're talking about high availability. You cannot go high availability more than 1 node failure. So if you have 12 vRealize operations node, not necessarily you will have 12 ESXi host in your cluster, right? So it's good to go with a smaller node count, so that you have the high availability and all your guidelines are intact in that. So this is all from my side, right? These are the reference materials, and trust me, this is really good information. Sizing guidelines and VMware validated design. For those who haven't interacted with VMware validated design, guys, these are the Bibles, right? Please go and take a look at it. It contains a lot of information, and few of the documentation are so well written that you can actually go ahead and if you start reading it, we call it as a recipe book, right? You can make your own soup just by following them. Reference architecture and deployment best practices, URL, any which ways you'll be receiving this slide deck, also this presentation on the YouTube, so you can go ahead and download it. This is the end, and I'm signing off. My name is Sidharth Swami. This is my Twitter handle. I blog at this page. vRealize Operations Manager is one of my favorite products, so that's why I talk about it a lot. My LinkedIn page, and that's all from my side. If you have any questions, I'm open for questions. Thank you.